a little bit this morning about one phrase in particular, which is an eye for an eye. And to start out with, we're going to take a look at the passages in which that phrase is used, and then we will go from there. But the first place that we're going to look at then is the text that was read for us in Leviticus chapter 24. We're not going to read those verses there because we've already listened to them just a few minutes ago. But in this text, or in the context of this phrase here, we see that it's talking about two things, really. It's talking about the loss of an animal, and then also the injury to a human, which are very different things, but they carry some of the same ideas of the law with them. And if a man kills another man, then the law is very specific that man should be put to death under the Mosaic law of the Old Testament. If, however, it's anything short of killing the other person, then there is a new set of laws that comes into effect. And if you don't kill the person, but you instead only injure the person, then you are to be injured in turn for it. And that's what we're going to be taking a look at, this idea of a sort of reciprocal kind of damage from the offender and now to the person that has done the offending. It goes both ways there. But this phrase is used 3 times in the Old Testament. So we see it here in Leviticus chapter 24. We also see it in Deuteronomy chapter 19. And there in verse 21 it says, the eye shall not pity life for life, or life shall be for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, and foot for foot. So it's the same exact principle that we've seen in Leviticus, just phrased a little bit differently. It also specifies that you should not take pity on the person that has done the wrong, but that some justice must be exacted there. So it shows this same kind of equal justice, this direct exchange that you have. And there's no more and no less being done, but it's an eye for an eye, not an eye for a hand, not a hand for a foot, but it's an eye for an eye. It's supposed to keep things kind of even, but still that's not the whole meaning of it. But there's one more place that we see it, and we see it used in Exodus chapter 21, starting verse 22. It says, if men fight and hurt a woman with child so that she gives birth prematurely, yet no harm follows, he shall surely be punished accordingly as the woman's husband imposes on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. That's the most exhaustive list that we have, and it's almost exhausting how many this for that there are in this verse. But again, it's that same evenness that you should have in distributing justice according to the Mosaic law. But in these couple verses, there's a few things we could mention. In verse 22, we have the whole due process of the law already established. So if a man is fighting and injures a woman who is pregnant, and if she gives birth prematurely and everything's fine, the law has a way of handling that. The husband will determine what needs to happen. The judges of the city will then agree to that or not, that compensation that needs to be made. If there is injury, though, in this case, it's not injury from one man to another, but it's injury from a man to a child that was previously unborn, which of course has a lot to say about what God thinks when it comes to abortion, but it also shows that it's not just about a man hurting another man, not just adults, but it applies across the board for the law. As it's in effect regardless of age or regardless of class or gender, this is going to still be in effect, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. So in all of these cases, though, it seems like what we are hearing is a law of revenge. And I think most of the time when we hear this, when we use this, when people, especially outside of the church, use this phrase, an eye for an eye, what they have in mind is revenge. That if someone takes your eye, then you take their eye in turn. But that is not the purpose of this law. It's very far from the purpose of this law, as we will see. What we have to understand so that we can understand this law is what the law was like before the law of Moses was around. Before the law of Moses, there were some other laws that were in place, and we'll talk about one in just a minute. But generally speaking, man did whatever they wanted to do. Kind of like in the days of the judges, man did whatever he thought was right in his heart. So, if that is your system of justice, then what do you do if somebody knocks out your tooth? If somebody knocks out your tooth, instead of knocking out one of their teeth, you knock out all their teeth. Maybe you kill them, you kill their family, you burn their house, you do whatever you can to pay them back for the wrong that they did to you. Sometimes you'll hear it called the law of the jungle. It's just the law of whatever I can do, whatever harm I can inflict, that's what I am going to do. So that's what the law is outside of the Bible. That's without any kind of morality. That's without any kind of law given from God. That's what people will do somewhat naturally, although I think most people are probably a little bit better than that. But it's a law of escalation. And it's maybe this isn't the best example, but if you've ever seen The Untouchables, there's a famous line in that movie that exemplifies this form of escalation that we're talking about. So Sean Connery's character says if you want to beat Al Capone, then he says if they pull a knife, then you pull a gun. If they send one of ours to the hospital, you send one of theirs to the morgue. This is the Chicago way. Again, escalation. So if somebody knocks out my tooth, I try to kill them. I try to do anything I can to them. So what does the law of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth say? It says if somebody knocks out your tooth, you can only do up to this level. If they knock out your eye, you can only knock out their eye. So at least on the surface, this is what we have to understand before we get a little bit deeper into it. That the best way of understanding this phrase is not to say an eye for an eye, but really only an eye for an eye. It's saying you cannot escalate the situation. You cannot say, okay, well they've injured my eye, so I'll kill them entirely. Or even if, for example, if they had killed someone in your family, you don't get to kill them and their whole family. That was common practice in ancient times, and still common practice in some places in the world. So it prevents this kind of vengeance. It limits the amount of revenge that can happen. So it's better than the law that came before it. We look back at this law and we say, well, this isn't a great law. It's not great that you could still take somebody's tooth if they took yours out. But at the same time, what it's trying to do is to limit the vengeful nature that man sometimes has. And for that, it's effective when it's done among the Jews. But two more things that we need to understand about this. Jewish tradition and then also the Code of Hammurabi. We're going to talk about both of those things. I think we'll actually, I was going to do it the other way, but I think we'll talk about this code first. So if you're a student of history at all, you're probably familiar with the Code of Hammurabi, which is a list of laws that are written on basically a giant pillar of rock that are from thousands of years ago before the Old Testament was written. And this is written by a king of Babylon, ancient Babylon, not the Neo-Babylon that we read about in the Bible. But in ancient Babylon, there was a king who wrote all these different laws. And among those laws was a very similar law to what we're talking about here. In fact, it even used the same phrase, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Now, there's a lot of debate among scholars as to how that influenced the Bible or whether the Bible influenced it in turn. And that doesn't really matter for our discussion right now. But this whole idea is the law of retaliation, or in Latin it's lex talionis, which means law of retaliation. And the law of retaliation, though, for the Babylonians was a lot different than it was for the Jews. So people look back and they say, oh, well, the Jews had this law and the Babylonians had this law, so I guess they were the same, but they're really not. Because the Babylonians' law was respective of class. It was respective of gender, as in if I as a man kill another man, then I could be put to death, but if I as a man kill a woman, then I don't have to be put to death. It's that kind of idea. Another extreme is if I built a house and you are in that house and that house collapses, you can kill me because I built the house and it didn't hold up. So while it is an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, it's a lot more extreme, a lot more severe. So then the last part of this is the Jewish law and the Jewish tradition around the law. We read in the Old Testament in these three places that the Jews had this law of an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth, and hand for hand, foot for foot. But in reality, there are no other laws in the Old Testament that would make that binding. There's no other laws in the Old Testament that require you to maim somebody when they have done so to you. Now, of course, you don't have to have more than one law to do something, but there's no other law in the Old Testament that says, well, if somebody cuts off your hand, then you get to cut off their hand. So it seems that this actually is more of a principle than a law in and of itself. The other reason that we can say that is because according to Jewish tradition, according to rabbinic tradition, according to the Talmud, this law was not actually intended to be in effect literally or physically, but instead this law was actually meant as a form of compensation, was supposed to be given. Not actually a hand for a hand, but instead a fair amount based on the value of a hand. I don't know how you would determine that, but again, according to the Talmud, according to all Jewish tradition dating back way before the time of Christ, they didn't enact this law literally. And there's no evidence that the Jews ever carried this out, physically speaking. No evidence that anyone ever knocked out somebody else's tooth because theirs had been first. So while we read this in the Old Testament, there's no scriptural evidence that says that this was the way it was carried out. So just because we read an eye for an eye, that doesn't necessarily make it literal. Instead, again, it seems that it was a law of equalness, a law trying to limit justice, saying you couldn't do more than this. But the law, whenever it went into effect, was really never done in a literal way. Nobody's eye was taken for somebody else's eye in practice. So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us or leads us into the New Testament. Because obviously the New Testament talks a little bit about this, most famously in Matthew chapter 5. And we go beyond just this idea of limiting vengeance to something even better. When Jesus addresses this point, he says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 38, "You've heard it that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you not to resist an evil person. But whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him also have your cloak. And whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. And give to him who asks, and from him who wants to borrow from you, do not turn away." Jesus gives a better way of looking at this law. Again, the Jews did have a law that limited vengeance, but Jesus says don't even seek vengeance. Don't seek to repay what was done to you. Jesus says that there is a better way. It's no longer okay to retaliate in kind, but when someone does you wrong, you don't even seek to settle the score. You just walk it off. You just act like it didn't happen. And of course, that's the example that we have in Christ's own life. If you consider what happened to him at his death, all the things that happened to him at his death, when he was resurrected, if he had followed the eye for an eye and the tooth for a tooth, imagine what would have happened to the Roman soldiers. Imagine what would have happened to the Pharisees if Jesus had decided that he wanted to retaliate. But Jesus doesn't. He takes all of that and he says, that's okay. And then he goes on without settling the score. A lot of times with Jesus, it seems like he is replacing the Old Testament, that he's rewriting the Old Testament, that it's contradictory to what the old law said. And we said with Islam a little bit ago that happens in the Quran, that instead of trying to mesh with the Old Testament, it seeks to rewrite it because it contradicts it so much. So if Jesus does the same thing, we have a problem, but in reality, Jesus does not rewrite the Old Testament. He doesn't overwrite the Old Testament, but instead he brings out what was already there. Let me give you an example of this. In Romans chapter 12. Of course, this is Paul writing here, but he says, therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you will heap coals of fire on his head. Verse 21, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Paul is quoting here from the Old Testament. Paul's quoting specifically from Proverbs chapter 25 when he says, if your enemy is hungry, feed him, and etc. He quotes from the Old Testament to say something very similar to what Jesus has just said in Matthew chapter 5. The reality is, even in the Old Testament, even though there was a law that said an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, there was also teaching in the Old Testament that said if your enemy, the person in opposition to you, the person who maybe already knocked out your tooth, if they're hungry, feed them. If they're thirsty, give them a drink. Jesus isn't teaching anything new. He's just telling the people that haven't been listening to the old law. He's telling the people that have ignored the old law, these are the parts you forgot about. You forgot about the aspect of grace and of mercy that was there even in the old law, that the Jews largely had forgotten by the time of Christ. Before the Old Testament, you had a system of lawlessness. And again, lawlessness says, if you knock out my tooth, I will seek to do all the harm that I can to you. Under the Old Testament, it says if someone knocks out your tooth, that you should not attempt to harm them any more than you have been harmed. But under the New Testament, if someone knocks out your tooth, you don't seek to do them any harm. So again, if you're following just the law of man, you try to do as much harm as possible. If you're following the Old Testament, you don't do any more harm than they did. If you follow the New Testament, you don't seek to do any harm, period. So there's a big difference in all three of those different groups. Also in this verse, probably should have pointed this out before, but in verse 21 when it says, if you feed your enemy, if you give them water, then you are heaping coals of fire on their head. That idiom is not meant to say that you're trying to injure this person. Instead, this is saying that you are trying to injure their conscience. You're trying to injure their mind. You're trying to injure them into the point that they feel guilty for what they've done. You're saying to them, yeah, I know you knocked out my tooth, but I'm going to respond in kindness. I'm going to repay evil with good. And the goal is not to harm them, but the goal is to have them see where they are mistaken in their behavior. The other side of this, though, don't want to leave this unbalanced. So does the New Testament here, does it teach pacifism? Does it teach that regardless of what someone does to you, you should not respond in any way of self-protection, of self-defense? Well, no, it doesn't. There's a lot of scholars that point to what Jesus says here or using the idea that he is specific in what he says. And if you'll notice the examples that are given here, in Romans it talks about feeding or giving water to someone that's thirsty. And in Jesus' examples it says if someone slaps you on the cheek. It says if someone wants to take your jacket from you, you give them your coat. And he says if someone wants you to carry their luggage for 1 mile, you do it for 2 miles. Those examples are inconvenient. Those examples are frustrating. Those examples are maybe even embarrassing sometimes. Those examples are all things that we don't want to do, things that would offend us, but those things are not violent in nature. I guess slapping is kind of violent, but they're not injurious in any real way. Let me say it this way. What if Jesus had said, instead of if someone slaps you, you turn and let them slap the other cheek? What if instead Jesus had said, if someone harms one of your children, give them your other child to harm too? Would you follow that? Could you follow that? Jesus isn't telling you to never respond with any kind of protection when it's necessary. Jesus is just saying, when these things take place, you don't respond in an evil way when something evil's done to you. So, just trying to balance that out to say that this is not straight pacifism. This is not just a way of saying that we should not ever stand up for ourselves when it is necessary, but we never respond with evil when evil is done toward us. How do we apply this? A few things. Number one, of course, remember what this phrase is actually intended to mean. The phrase of this whole lesson, an eye for an eye. Again, it has to be said that it's only an eye for an eye. It's not an eye, or it's not a life for an eye. It's not any evil for an eye. It's just an eye for an eye. It's no more than that. It limits the amount of vengeance that you can take. And of course, Jesus goes even farther than that to say, you don't even need to take that kind of revenge. You don't even need to repay that kind of evil. Second thing is that we don't have to try to get even with people. The phrase, of course, made famous by Martin Luther King Jr. is that an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth leaves everybody blind and toothless. And of course, no better off than they are right now. So that law of retaliation doesn't work, especially in the long term. And that's why Christ teaches us against it. The third thing, and this is something that I think is maybe more direct application because we can all be guilty of this and have been at different times. But it is very easy for us, I guess it's a very human side of us, but it's easy for us to take pride in retaliating. And you may say, well, I don't take pride in retaliating. I don't take pride in getting into fights. But at the same time, sometimes we do pretty much exactly that when we say, well, I gave that person a piece of my mind. Whatever they said to me, I let them have it. I let them know about it. Is that a good thing? Is that a positive? Is that the way Christ responds? Is that the way Christ teaches us to respond? If someone, this is kind of an out there example, but if someone parks in a spot that you wanted to park in, or maybe they parked so poorly that you couldn't park next to them, well, then you leave them a nice little note on their windshield to tell them exactly how you feel about it. And you let everybody else know that you did that deed, and you're proud about it. You have a sense of bragging about it. Or maybe it's a waitress that was very poor in their service, and you didn't leave them any tip. And you let other people know about that. Or maybe it's something that you do on social media. Maybe it's a comment that you leave in response to something else that repays evil for evil, that doesn't go the extra mile, that doesn't turn the other cheek, but instead seeks to escalate. Instead, it seeks to retaliate. And that's not what Christ has taught us to do, but we can be very guilty of that. And we, as all people, we should be known as peacemakers. Not as people that escalate, not as people that retaliate, not as people that are retaliators, but people that make peace. That's how people should know that we're Christians. That if we behave as the world behaves, if we respond in kind to how the world treats us, then nobody will know the difference. So this week, of course, and beyond this week, where is it that I can show more love? Where can I show a little more kindness in response to the people that I don't necessarily agree with? Where can I show a little more grace? Where can I be more like Christ in my response to other people? Here's the last message. If we were trying to apply this principle to our own life, then we might say, well, I'm a pretty nice person, and I treat people pretty well, and so they would probably treat me pretty well, right? But what if I applied this principle to my life in a spiritual sense? What if I said that I should get exactly what's coming to me spiritually? What if I wanted God to retaliate against me for the life that I've lived? If I wanted God to have an eye for an eye with me, what would happen? If I wanted God to have a tooth for a tooth with me, if I said, God, I've lived a pretty good life, right? I've lived a life that deserves to be punished. I live a life that deserves to spend eternity in hell. And God says, I don't respond that way. God says, I don't take an eye for an eye. I don't take a tooth for a tooth, but I'll overlook even that because of what my son went through on your behalf. This morning, if you need to take advantage of that, this is a great time. It's a perfect time. Don't wait until any later than today. You don't have that guarantee. This morning, if you need to get yourself right with God, if this is a time in your life when you have struggled, when you've strayed away from Him, this is the time to come back. If there's anything that we can do for you, if there's any need that you have in the congregation, we ask that you come forward now as we stand, as we sing.